What happens when a woman the world has thrown away meets a warrior who sees her true worth? In the harsh frontier of 1860s Texas, where survival meant everything and love seemed like a luxury few could afford, one woman's journey from worthless outcast to fierce protector would challenge everything society believed about value, strength, and the power of unconditional acceptance. This is not just a love story. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to heal, transform, and rise above the cruelest labels the world can place upon us. Sarah McKenna had been called many things: worthless, damaged goods, a burden unfit for decent society. But she had never been called beloved, until a Comanche warrior saw past her scars to the fire burning within her soul. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Texas, as Sarah McKenna swept the porch of the boarding house for the third time that day. Her movements were quick and efficient, born from years of trying to make herself invisible while still being useful enough to earn her keep. At 23, she had the weathered hands of a woman twice her age and eyes that held too much knowledge of human cruelty. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, emerged from the kitchen with her usual scowl firmly in place. She was a woman who measured worth in dollars and respectability, and Sarah possessed neither. The arrangement they had was simple. Sarah worked from dawn until well past dusk, cleaning, cooking, and maintaining the establishment in exchange for a small room in the attic and 2 meals a day. It was survival, not living, but it was more than most people in Cedar Ridge thought she deserved. That sweeping ain't gonna make the dirt disappear permanent, girl, Mrs. Patterson snapped, her voice carrying the particular venom she reserved for Sarah. And, mind you, stay out of sight when the Reverend comes calling this afternoon. Last thing I need is decent folks seeing you and getting the wrong idea about what kind of establishment I run. Sarah nodded silently, her jaw tight with practiced restraint. She had learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse. The people of Cedar Ridge had made their judgment about her years ago, and nothing she could say or do would change their minds. In their eyes, she would always be the girl who had survived what no decent woman should survive, tainted by experiences that made her unfit for proper society. The story of her disgrace was well known throughout the small frontier town. 5 years earlier, at 18, Sarah had been traveling with a wagon train from Missouri to California with her parents and younger brother when Comanche raiders had attacked. She was the sole survivor, found 3 days later by a cavalry patrol, wandering the prairie in a torn dress with blood that wasn't her own on her hands and a look in her eyes that spoke of horrors beyond imagination. The soldiers who found her had been kind enough, offering her water and a blanket, speaking in gentle tones as they tried to coax information from her about what had happened. But even their kindness came with assumptions. They assumed she had been defiled, broken, made worthless by her captivity. They never asked her directly about what the Comanche had done to her during those 3 days, but their eyes held a mixture of pity and disgust that spoke louder than words. When the cavalry brought her to Cedar Ridge, the supposedly Christian community had received her with charity that felt more like punishment. They housed her, fed her, and clothed her, but they also whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. The women spoke in hushed tones about her ordeal and how no decent man would ever want her now. The men looked at her with a combination of curiosity and revulsion, as if she were a fascinating specimen of human ruin. Mrs. Patterson had taken her in not out of kindness, but out of practicality. She needed cheap labor, and Sarah needed shelter. The arrangement suited them both, though Mrs. Patterson never let Sarah forget that she was doing her a favor that few others would extend to someone of her condition. As Sarah finished sweeping and moved inside to begin preparing the noon meal, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging in the hallway. The face that looked back at her was unremarkable in most ways. Brown hair pulled back severely, green eyes that had once sparkled with youth, but now held a guarded wariness, skin tanned from outdoor work. The only visible sign of her ordeal was a thin scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, a reminder of the violence that had changed her life forever. But it wasn't the physical scars that made her unlovable in the eyes of Cedar Ridge. It was the invisible marks, the assumption that she had been broken beyond repair, that she carried some kind of spiritual contamination that made her unfit for normal human connection. The townspeople treated her with the careful distance one might maintain around a diseased animal. Useful perhaps, but never to be touched or truly accepted. The kitchen work provided Sarah with a familiar rhythm that helped quiet her restless thoughts. She had become an excellent cook out of necessity, and even Mrs. Patterson had to admit that her biscuits were the best in 3 counties. But compliments were rare, and criticism was abundant. If the coffee was too strong, if the stew needed more salt, if the floors weren't spotless enough, Sarah heard about it immediately and in detail. Around midday, as she was preparing lunch for the handful of boarders who called Mrs. Patterson's establishment home, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 of the regular boarders, Mr. Jameson and Mr. Wilkes, were discussing the latest Indian troubles in the area. Heard there's been Comanche sightings south of here, Jameson was saying, his voice carrying the authority of a man who believed his opinions were always worth hearing. Cattle missing, tracks found near the Morrison place. Sheriff thinks they might be planning something bigger. Wilkes nodded gravely. Time was, we could count on the army to keep them in line. Now with the war back east taking most of the soldiers, we're sitting ducks out here. Mark my words, it's only a matter of time before they get bold enough to attack the town itself. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she sliced bread for the meal. The mere mention of Comanche presence in the area was enough to send her mind racing back to memories she fought every day to suppress. She could still smell the smoke from burning wagons, still hear her mother's screams, still feel the weight of her younger brother's lifeless body in her arms. But mixed with the terror and grief were other memories, ones that confused and frightened her in different ways. Not everything about her 3 days with the Comanche had been horror. There had been moments of unexpected kindness, glimpses of humanity that didn't fit with what she had been taught about the savage Indians. These contradictory memories were part of what made her story so difficult for the people of Cedar Ridge to process. A simple tale of captivity and abuse they could understand and categorize, but the complexity of her actual experience threatened their neat worldview. Maybe they'll take that McKenna girl with them when they go. Wilkes continued with a cruel laugh. Might be doing us all a favor. Lord knows she's been nothing but a reminder of unpleasant things since she got here. The bread knife slipped in Sarah's hand, nicking her finger and drawing a thin line of blood. She pressed a cloth to the small wound and tried to steady her breathing. 5 years of such comments had taught her to endure them in silence, but they still had the power to cut deep. The implication was always the same. She was damaged goods, a burden to decent society, someone who would be better off disappearing entirely. Mrs. Patterson's voice calling from the dining room interrupted her dark thoughts. Sarah, where's that lunch? These men have work to get back to. She quickly finished preparing the meal and carried the plates to the dining room, keeping her eyes down as she served the boarders. As she set Mr. Wilkes' plate in front of him, he made a show of moving his chair back slightly, as if even the briefest contact with her might contaminate him. It was a small cruelty, but one that had been repeated so many times over the years that it had worn a permanent groove in her spirit. The afternoon brought a brief respite when Mrs. Patterson left a visit with some of the church ladies, leaving Sarah alone with her chores. These solitary hours were precious to her, the only time when she could let down her guard and simply exist without the constant weight of judgment and expectation. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she had overheard about the Comanche sightings. Part of her was genuinely terrified at the prospect of encountering any Indians again. The trauma of losing her family was real and deep, and she had no desire to relive those horrible moments. But another part of her, a part she rarely acknowledged even to herself, wondered what would happen if she encountered the Comanche again under different circumstances. During her captivity, she had been cared for by a woman named Winter Moon, an older Comanche woman whose husband had been killed in a cavalry raid. Winter Moon had treated Sarah's wounds, given her food and clean clothes, and spoken to her in gentle tones, even though they shared no common language. The woman's kindness had been a beacon of humanity in the midst of unthinkable horror, and Sarah had never forgotten it. There had also been a young warrior, perhaps a few years older than herself, who had watched over her with an intensity that had both frightened and intrigued her. His name, she later learned, was Tahlequah, which meant two is enough in his language. He had never touched her inappropriately or shown her any violence, but his dark eyes had seemed to see straight through to her soul in a way that no one before or since had managed. These memories were dangerous territory for Sarah's mind. They challenged the narrative that everyone in Cedar Ridge, including herself most of the time, accepted as truth. If the Comanche had shown her kindness, if there had been moments of connection and even beauty in her captivity, what did that mean about her worth as a human being? What did it mean about the assumptions everyone had made about her experience? The sound of horses approaching the boarding house interrupted her thoughts and sent her quickly to the window. A group of men on horseback had stopped in front of the building, their faces grim and their weapons clearly visible. At their head was Sheriff Morrison, a man whose opinion carried significant weight in Cedar Ridge and who had never made any secret of his belief that Sarah was more trouble than she was worth. Sarah quickly moved away from the window and busied herself with meaningless tasks, hoping the men would conduct their business and leave without requiring her presence. But luck was not on her side. Within minutes, she heard the heavy footsteps of multiple men entering the boarding house and Sheriff Morrison's voice calling for Mrs. Patterson. When no answer came, the footsteps moved toward the kitchen, and Sarah found herself face to face with 6 armed men, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "Where's Mrs. Patterson?" he demanded without preamble. "She's visiting with the church ladies, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to build in her chest. "She'll be back within the hour." Morrison studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious distaste. "Well, maybe you can help us then. We're tracking Comanche signs in the area, and we need to know if you've seen anything unusual. Any Indians hanging around, watching the place, anything like that." Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, sir, nothing like that. Been quiet here." One of the other men, a rancher named Bill Crawford, stepped forward with a sneer. "Maybe she wouldn't tell us even if she had seen something. Maybe she's got loyalty to her Comanche friends." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The implication that she might be in league with the Indians, that her captivity had somehow turned her into a traitor to her own people, was one of the cruelest suggestions that could be made. But she had heard variations of it before, whispered behind her back when people thought she wasn't listening. "I would never," she began, but Morrison cut her off with a gesture. "Nobody's accusing you of anything, girl," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But facts are facts. You survived something that killed everyone else in your wagon train. You lived with them Comanche for 3 days and came back talking about how they treated you decent. Some folks might wonder about that." The kitchen felt smaller with 6 armed men crowding into it, their suspicion filling the air like smoke. Sarah could see the assumption in their eyes, the belief that her survival had come at the cost of her humanity. In their minds, the only way she could have lived through her captivity was by collaborating with her captors, by betraying the memory of her dead family. "I never said they treated me decent," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never said anything about how they treated me." And that was the problem, she realized. Her silence about the details of her captivity had been interpreted as evidence of shameful secrets. The townspeople had filled in the blanks with their own assumptions, creating a story that painted her as either a victim too broken to be trusted or a traitor too corrupted to be tolerated. Crawford stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Maybe it's time you did start talking, girl. Maybe it's time you told us exactly what happened during them 3 days. Might help us understand what we're dealing with if them Comanche come calling again." Sarah's heart began to race as the men closed in around her. She could see the hunger in their eyes, the desire to hear details of her ordeal that would confirm their worst assumptions about what had been done to her. They wanted her to describe her own degradation, to give them the sordid details they could whisper about later while shaking their heads in false sympathy. "I don't remember much," she lied, her voice growing stronger. "It was difficult. I try not to think about it." "Don't remember?" Morrison's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Girl, you were gone for 3 days. You expect us to believe you don't remember anything about what they did to you." The truth was that Sarah remembered everything about those 3 days with painful clarity. She remembered the initial terror, the grief over her family, the certainty that she would die. But she also remembered Winter Moon's gentle care, the way Tahlequah had protected her from the more aggressive young warriors, the moments when she had glimpsed the humanity and complexity of people she had been taught to see as monsters. Most dangerous of all, she remembered the way Tahlequah had looked at her not with lust or cruelty, but with something that might have been respect. He had seen her fight to save her brother's life, had witnessed her courage in the face of impossible odds, and his expression had held something she had never seen in the eyes of any white man. The recognition that she had value beyond her potential usefulness to men. These memories were her most closely guarded secrets, not because they were shameful, but because they challenged everything the people of Cedar Ridge believed about Indians, about her, and about what her survival meant. If she told the truth about her captivity, she would not only be confirming her contamination in their eyes, but she would also be revealing a complexity to the situation that their simple worldview could not accommodate. "I remember being scared," she said finally, giving them a partial truth. "I remember my family dying. I remember walking until the soldiers found me. Everything else is confused." Crawford grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Maybe we can help you remember. Maybe a little encouragement would clear up that confusion." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of horses approaching at a gallop reached them through the open window. The men turned toward the sound, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. Sarah used the distraction to pull free from Crawford's grip and move toward the back of the kitchen, putting distance between herself and the increasingly hostile group. A young man burst through the front door without knocking, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sheriff Morrison, you need to come quick. The Johnson Ranch, it's been hit. Cattle scattered, buildings burned, and..." He paused, noticing Sarah for the first time. "Maybe we should talk outside." Morrison nodded grimly. "We'll finish this conversation later," he told Sarah, his voice carrying a clear threat. "And you'd better hope your memory improves before we do." The men filed out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and shaking hands. She sank into a chair at the small kitchen table, trying to process what had just happened. The hostility she had faced was nothing new, but the direct threats and physical intimidation marked an escalation that frightened her deeply. As she sat in the sudden silence of the empty house, Sarah found herself thinking once again about Tahlequah and the way he had looked at her during those 3 days. In a world that saw her as either a victim to be pitted or a threat to be eliminated, the memory of being seen as a person of worth was both comforting and dangerous. She understood now that her position in Cedar Ridge was becoming increasingly precarious. The combination of growing Indian troubles in the area and her own mysterious past was creating a perfect storm of suspicion and hostility. It would not be long before someone decided that she was more liability than asset, and when that happened, she would need to be ready. Sarah rose from the chair and walked to the small window that looked out over the prairie beyond the town. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of grass and sky, was a world where she might be judged by different standards. It was a dangerous world, full of uncertainties and threats, but it was also a world where the labels that had been placed on her might not matter. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah McKenna began to seriously consider the possibility of leaving Cedar Ridge behind. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Mrs. Patterson returned from her visit, full of gossip and complaints about the state of the world. Sarah listened with half an ear as she went about her chores, her mind still occupied with the confrontation with Sheriff Morrison and his men. "And Martha Henderson says her husband saw Indian sign near their north pasture," Mrs. Patterson was saying as she settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea. "Mark my words, we're in for trouble. Should have driven them all out years ago instead of letting them run wild on reservations." Sarah nodded absently as she prepared the evening meal, but her thoughts were far from Mrs. Patterson's complaints. She was thinking about survival, about choices, and about the possibility that somewhere in the world was a place where she might finally be allowed to live rather than simply exist. As night fell over Cedar Ridge, Sarah lay in her small attic room and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. In the distance, she could hear coyotes calling to each other across the prairie, their voices wild and free. For the first time since her return to civilization, she found herself envying them their freedom to run wherever the night might take them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations, and new reminders of her place at the bottom of Cedar Ridge's social order. But tonight, in the privacy of her own thoughts, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where the labels that had defined her for so long might finally be stripped away, leaving only the essential truth of who she was beneath them all. The woman the people of Cedar Ridge called Unlovable closed her eyes and dreamed of running wild and free across an endless prairie, her past, and its painful judgments falling away behind her like shed skin. 3 days after Sheriff Morrison's threatening visit, Sarah's world changed forever in the most unexpected way possible. She had been gathering wild herbs along the creek that ran behind the boarding house, a task that gave her an excuse to escape the suffocating atmosphere of town and spend time alone in nature. The morning was crisp and clear, with a kind of endless blue sky that made the Texas prairie seem to stretch into eternity. Sarah had always found peace in these solitary expeditions. Away from the judgmental eyes and cruel whispers of Cedar Ridge, she could simply exist as herself without the constant weight of other people's expectations and assumptions. She moved carefully along the creek bank, searching for the wild mint and prairie sage that Mrs. Patterson used in her cooking, though she suspected the woman would find some reason to criticize whatever Sarah brought back. The attack came without warning. Sarah was kneeling beside a promising patch of herbs when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound. Multiple horses moving at speed, the kind of approach that usually meant trouble on the frontier. She dropped her gathering basket and scrambled toward a large cottonwood tree, hoping to conceal herself until whatever danger was approaching had passed. But she was too late. 3 riders crested the small hill above the creek, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw they were not the white men she had expected. These were Comanche warriors, their horses painted for war, their faces stern with purpose. For a moment that seemed to last forever, both Sarah and the warriors simply stared at each other in mutual surprise. The leader of the group was a man Sarah recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed. Tahlequah sat astride a magnificent black stallion, his long dark hair flowing free in the morning breeze, his muscled chest bare except for a necklace of bear claws that caught the sunlight. He was older than she remembered, his face marked by new scars and the weathering that came from a life lived entirely outdoors. But his dark eyes were exactly as she remembered them, intense, intelligent, and absolutely fearless. For several heartbeats, neither Sarah nor the warriors moved. The 2 younger men with Tahlequah looked between their leader and the white woman by the creek, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. Sarah could see questions in their expressions, confusion about why their war leader was hesitating instead of either capturing or killing the lone woman they had discovered. Then Tahlequah spoke a single word in the Comanche language, and everything changed. "Sukuru," he said, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled at the sound. It was a name he had given her during her captivity, a word that meant stand strong in his language. He remembered her. After 5 years, he not only recognized her, but still thought of her by the name that acknowledged her courage rather than her victimhood. The 2 younger warriors looked even more confused now, glancing between Tahlequah and Sarah, as if trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense to them. One of them started to speak, but Tahlequah silenced him with a sharp gesture, never taking his eyes off Sarah. Sarah found herself frozen, caught between terror and something that might have been relief. All the old memories came flooding back, not just the trauma and violence, but also the unexpected moments of connection and recognition she had shared with this man. In the civilization that had rejected her, she was broken goods, damaged beyond repair, unfit for human love. But in Tahlequah's eyes, she saw something entirely different, the same respect and recognition she remembered from 5 years ago. Slowly, carefully, Tahlequah dismounted from his horse and walked toward her. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening, like someone approaching a frightened animal. When he was still several feet away, he stopped and spoke again, this time in the broken English she remembered he possessed. "You remember," he said, and it was not a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. How could she forget? Those 3 days had shaped everything that had happened to her since, had defined her place in the world and her understanding of herself. But hearing him acknowledge their shared history, standing here face to face with him again, made those memories feel more real and immediate than they had in years. "You are well?" Tahlequah asked, his English careful but clear. His eyes took in her appearance, noting the simple dress, the calloused hands, the way she held herself with the practiced wariness of someone who expected hostility from the world. The question was so unexpected, so genuine in its concern that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time anyone had asked about her well-being and actually cared about the answer? Mrs. Patterson certainly never inquired about anything beyond Sarah's ability to work. The townspeople avoided speaking to her directly whenever possible. Even the preacher's weekly visits were focused on her soul's salvation rather than her earthly happiness. Sarah started, then stopped. How could she explain 5 years of grinding existence, of being tolerated but never accepted, of working from dawn to dusk just to earn the right to sleep under a roof? How could she describe the suffocating weight of being labeled and dismissed, of never being allowed to be anything more than her worst moment? Tahlequah seemed to understand her struggle without needing words. His expression grew serious, and he took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the concern in his dark eyes. "They do not treat you with honor," he said, and again it was not a question. Somehow, just by looking at her, he could see what 5 years of life in Cedar Ridge had done to her spirit. One of the younger warriors called out something in Comanche, his voice urgent. Sarah caught enough of the words to understand that he was warning Tahlequah about the danger of staying in one place too long, especially so close to a white settlement. Tahlequah replied sharply without turning around, his tone making it clear that the conversation was not open for debate. "We cannot stay long," Tahlequah told Sarah, switching back to English. "Your people hunt us, but I would know that you are safe, that you are happy." The last word seemed to cost him effort, as if happiness were a concept he wasn't sure translated properly between their worlds. But Sarah understood what he was asking, and the fact that he cared enough to ask it at all broke something loose inside her chest. "I'm not," she said simply, the honesty surprising even herself. "I'm not happy. I'm not safe, not really. They tolerate me because I work hard, but they don't want me. They never have." Tahlequah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of anger cross his features. It was not anger directed at her, she realized, but anger on her behalf. The idea that someone would treat her with such callous indifference clearly offended his sense of justice. "You saved your brother," he said quietly. "Fought like warrior when others ran in fear. This is who you are, not what they tell you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was talking about the moments during the wagon train attack when she had fought desperately to protect her younger brother Tommy, using her own body as a shield and fighting off attackers with whatever weapon she could find. She had failed to save Tommy in the end, but Tahlequah had witnessed her courage and determination in that impossible situation. It was the first time in 5 years that anyone had acknowledged her bravery during those terrible hours. Everyone else, including herself most of the time, focused only on her survival and what it might mean about her virtue or her loyalty. But Tahlequah remembered her fighting spirit, her refusal to give up even when hope was gone. "Tommy died anyway," Sarah whispered, the guilt that had haunted her for years rising to the surface. "Tommy died because bad men killed him," Tahlequah corrected firmly. "You did not fail. You fought with honor. This I saw." The validation was overwhelming. For 5 years, Sarah had carried the weight of guilt and shame, convinced that she should have done more, should have found a way to save her family, should have died with them rather than surviving to become a burden on the community. But Tahlequah's perspective offered her something she had never allowed herself to consider. The possibility that she had actually done everything she could, that her survival was not a mark of shame, but evidence of her strength. The sound of horses approaching in the distance interrupted the moment. The younger warriors immediately grew alert, their hands moving to their weapons as they scanned the horizon for signs of threat. Tahlequah remained focused on Sarah, but she could see the tension enter his posture. "You must choose," he said urgently. "Stay with people who see you as broken thing, or come with us. Live free." The offer hit Sarah like a physical blow. Come with them? Leave Cedar Ridge and everything she had known for the past 5 years? The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Life with the Comanche would be dangerous, uncertain, completely outside the bounds of everything she had been taught about proper behavior for a woman of her background. But what did she really have in Cedar Ridge? A tiny attic room, endless work for little appreciation, and the constant weight of judgment from people who would never see her as anything more than a cautionary tale. Mrs. Patterson would replace her easily enough. There were always desperate people looking for work. The townspeople would probably be relieved to have the uncomfortable reminder of frontier violence removed from their midst. Sarah started, but the approaching hoofbeats were getting closer. She could hear voices now, calling back and forth across the prairie. It sounded like a search party, probably looking for signs of the Indian raiders who had hit the Johnson Ranch. Tahlequah's warriors were growing increasingly agitated, clearly eager to leave before they were discovered. But their leader remained focused on Sarah, waiting for her answer with an intensity that took her breath away. She realized that this decision, made in a handful of seconds beside a Texas creek, would determine the entire course of her future life. "If I come with you," Sarah said quickly, "what would happen to me? What would I be?" "You would be Tsuku," Tahlequah replied immediately. "Woman who stands strong. My woman, if you will have me." The declaration was simple and direct, without flowery language or elaborate courtship rituals. But it contained something that Sarah had never expected to hear directed at her. A straightforward statement of desire and respect from a man who had seen her at her worst moment and still found her worthy of love. The approaching voices were getting closer now, and Sarah could make out individual words. Sheriff Morrison's voice was among them, harsh and demanding as he questioned someone about recent sightings. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice that would change everything. All her life, Sarah had been told what she was supposed to want: a proper marriage to a respectable man, a comfortable home, the approval of her community, safety, and security within the bounds of civilized society. But 5 years of living within those bounds had taught her that they were not meant for her. In the eyes of respectable people, she would always be damaged goods, a reminder of unpleasant realities they preferred not to acknowledge. But Tahlequah was offering her something completely different: the chance to be valued for her strength rather than pitted for her supposed weakness, to be seen as a warrior rather than a victim, to live free rather than simply survive. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision than like recognizing something that had always been true. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear despite the chaos in her heart. "Yes, I'll come with you." Tahlequah's face transformed with relief and something that might have been joy. He moved quickly to his horse and returned with a second mount, a sturdy brown mare that looked capable of carrying a rider across long distances. Without ceremony, he helped Sarah mount the horse, his strong hands steadying her as she settled into the unfamiliar saddle. The other warriors had already started moving, heading away from the approaching search party at a pace designed to put distance between themselves and potential pursuit without exhausting their horses. Tahlequah swung onto his black stallion and moved alongside Sarah, ready to help if she had trouble controlling her mount. As they rode away from the creek, Sarah turned back once to look at Cedar Ridge in the distance. The small collection of buildings looked insignificant against the vastness of the prairie, a tiny outpost of civilization surrounded by endless wild country. She was leaving behind everything she had known for the past 5 years, abandoning the only security she had ever possessed as an adult. But she was also leaving behind the suffocating weight of other people's expectations and judgments. For the first time since her family's death, she was making a choice based on what she wanted rather than what others thought she deserved. The sensation of riding fast across open country was intoxicating. Sarah had forgotten how it felt to move with such freedom, to have the wind in her face and the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The horse beneath her was responsive and sure-footed, and within minutes, she found herself matching the rhythm of the other riders as if she had been born to this life. Tahlequah rode close beside her, his presence both protective and encouraging. When he caught her looking at him, he smiled, and Sarah was startled to realize she was smiling back. When was the last time she had smiled with genuine happiness rather than the careful, placating expression she wore around Mrs. Patterson and the boarders? They rode hard for nearly an hour before Tahlequah signaled for a brief rest beside a small stream. As the horses drank and rested, the younger warriors approached Sarah with curiosity rather than hostility. One of them, who looked to be about her own age, spoke to Tahlequah in rapid Comanche, gesturing towards Sarah as he did so. "He asked why you chose to come with us," Tahlequah translated. "He says white women usually fight and scream when taken." Sarah looked at the young warrior directly as she answered, "Because no one has ever asked me what I wanted before. Because I was tired of being told what I was supposed to be." Tahlequah translated her response, and both younger men nodded thoughtfully. Whatever they had expected from the white woman their leader had claimed, her directness and lack of fear seemed to meet with their approval. As they prepared to mount up again, Sarah realized that she had not asked the most practical question. Where exactly were they going? The thought should have terrified her, but instead she found it oddly liberating. For 5 years, her life had been rigidly structured, every day the same as the last, every choice made for her by circumstances beyond her control. Now she was riding into the unknown with people who had every reason to distrust her, following a man who remembered her as something other than a victim, heading toward a future that was completely unwritten. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely unlike anything she had ever imagined for herself. When she voiced her question about their destination, Tahlequah's answer was characteristically direct. "To my people," he said simply. "To home." Sarah nodded and settled herself more securely in her saddle. She was going home with Tahlequah, to a place where she might finally be allowed to discover who she really was beneath all the labels and assumptions that had been placed upon her. The woman Cedar Ridge had called Unlovable was about to find out what it meant to be claimed by a warrior who saw her true worth. The afternoon sun was warm on her back as they rode deeper into the prairie, leaving civilization and all its restrictive definitions far behind. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah McKenna was exactly where she chose to be, riding toward a future that would be entirely her own making. The Comanche village appeared on the horizon like something from a dream Sarah had forgotten she ever had. Set in a protected valley between rolling hills, the collection of teepees and lodges seemed to grow naturally from the landscape itself, as if the earth had sprouted temporary shelters that could be folded up and moved at will. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played between the dwellings, and the whole scene pulsed with a vitality that made Cedar Ridge seem lifeless by comparison. As their small party approached the village, Sarah became acutely aware of the attention they were drawing. People emerged from their homes to watch the arrival of Tahlequah and his warriors, and their eyes inevitably settled on the white woman riding among them. Sarah felt her old anxiety begin to rise, the familiar dread of being judged, and found wanting by a community that had already decided what she represented. But something was different here. The looks she received were curious rather than hostile, questioning rather than condemning. There was wariness, certainly, but it was a natural caution any group would show toward an outsider rather than the specific disgust and pity she had grown accustomed to in Cedar Ridge. Tahlequah seemed to sense her growing nervousness. He guided his horse closer to hers and spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "My people will not judge you by what white man thinks," he said. "Here, you prove yourself by what you do, not what happened to you." The words were meant to be comforting, but they also highlighted the challenge that lay ahead. In Cedar Ridge, Sarah's role had been fixed and unchanging. She was the damaged woman who cleaned and cooked and tried to stay invisible. Here, she would have to discover who she could become when freed from those limiting expectations. They rode directly to the center of the village, where a large lodge stood apart from the others. Even Sarah could tell that this was a place of importance, probably belonging to a chief or elder. As they dismounted, an older woman emerged from the lodge, her graying hair braided with silver ornaments, her bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of leadership. This was Singing Bird, Tahlequah's aunt, and one of the most respected women in their band. She looked Sarah over with sharp, intelligent eyes, taking in everything from her worn dress to her calloused hands to the way she held herself with unconscious defensive posture. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Comanche, with Tahlequah explaining Sarah's presence to his aunt, while other villagers gradually gathered to listen. Sarah caught only fragments of what was being said, but she could tell from the tone and gestures that her history was being discussed, along with Tahlequah's intentions regarding her. At one point, Singing Bird asked a direct question that made Tahlequah pause before answering. When he replied, his voice carried a conviction that needed no translation. He was defending Sarah, making a case for her acceptance into the community. Finally, Singing Bird stepped forward and addressed Sarah directly in careful English. "Tahlequah says you chose to come with us. Says you are not happy with your own people. Is this true?" Sarah nodded, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "Yes, it's true. They didn't see me as I really am." "And how do you see yourself?" Singing Bird asked, her question cutting straight to the heart of something Sarah had been avoiding for years. The question hung in the air between them, while Sarah struggled to find an answer. For so long, her identity had been defined by other people's perceptions: victim, burden, damaged goods, unlovable. But, stripped of those external labels, who was she really? I don't know, Sarah admitted finally. I've spent so long being what other people expected me to be that I'm not sure who I am underneath it all. Singing Bird nodded as if this answer satisfied her more than any confident declaration might have. Good. Woman who thinks she knows everything cannot learn anything. Cool me. Without further ceremony, Singing Bird led Sarah into the large lodge, leaving Tahlequah outside to tend to his horse and report to the village council about their recent activities. The interior of the lodge was spacious and comfortable, with beautifully decorated buffalo robes covering the ground and personal belongings arranged with obvious care and pride. You will stay with me until you find your place here, Singing Bird announced, settling onto a pile of furs and gesturing for Sarah to sit across from her. But understand this, I will not coddle you or make excuses for you. If you wish to belong here, you must earn it. Sarah nodded, grateful for the directness. The careful tiptoeing around her feelings that characterized most interactions in Cedar Ridge had always felt more insulting than helpful. At least here, she would know where she stood based on her own actions rather than other people's assumptions. What will you require of me? Sarah asked. Singing Bird smiled for the first time since their introduction, and it transformed her stern features into something almost motherly. Learn our ways. Work hard. Protect what is important. Same things we require of anyone who calls this place home. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about Comanche life and culture. Under Singing Bird's patient but demanding tutelage, she began to understand the complex social structures that govern the band, the seasonal rhythms that dictated their movements, and the skills that meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving on the frontier. The learning was humbling. Tasks that looked simple from the outside proved to require years of practice to master. Preparing buffalo hides for use as clothing and lodge covers involved a dozen different steps, each of which had to be performed perfectly to avoid wasting precious resources. The intricacies of food preservation, plant identification, and weather prediction represented a vast body of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. But Sarah found that she had an aptitude for this kind of learning that had never been recognized in her previous life. In Cedar Ridge, her intelligence had been irrelevant. No one cared whether she was smart as long as she could cook and clean adequately. Here, her ability to observe, remember, and adapt was not only noticed but actively encouraged. Tahlequah was a frequent presence during these early weeks, though he was careful not to overwhelm her with attention while she was still finding her footing in the community. He would appear at Singing Bird's lodge in the evenings, sometimes bringing gifts of game he had hunted, other times simply sitting quietly while the two women worked on various projects. These evening visits gave Sarah the opportunity to observe him in his natural environment, and what she saw impressed her deeply. Within his own community, Tahlequah was clearly respected not just for his prowess as a warrior, but for his judgment and integrity. Young men sought his advice, elders included him in important discussions, and children followed him around with obvious adoration. But it was the way he treated the women of the village that most surprised Sarah. In Cedar Ridge, women were expected to defer to male authority in all matters of importance. Here, she watched Tahlequah engage in serious conversations with Singing Bird and other senior women, clearly valuing their opinions and incorporating their advice into his decision-making. One evening, as autumn began to paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Tahlequah arrived at the lodge with something more than his usual quiet companionship. He carried with him a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, which he presented to Sarah with uncharacteristic nervousness. "For you," he said simply, setting the bundle down between them. Sarah unwrapped the deerskin carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. It was a dress of the finest workmanship she had ever seen, made from butter-soft doeskin and decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that seemed to tell a story. The blue and white beads caught the firelight like scattered stars, and the fringe moved gently with each breath of air. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, running her fingers over the delicate beadwork. "But I couldn't." "You could and you will," Singing Bird interrupted firmly. "This is not charity, child. This is recognition. The dress tells your story. At Sarah's questioning look, Tahlequah pointed to different sections of the beadwork. Here, he said, indicating a pattern of red and black beads near the neckline. This shows the fire you carried when you fought to protect your brother. And here, he moved his finger to a flowing blue design along the hem. This shows the water of tears that washed away your old life so new one could begin. The symbolism was overwhelming. Someone had taken the time to translate her history into art, to create something beautiful from experiences that had been treated as sources of shame for so long. The dress represented not just acceptance, but celebration of who she was and what she had endured. Who made it? Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. Many hands, Tahlequah replied. My aunt began it, but other women added their work. When word spread about your story, they wanted to contribute. This is how we welcome someone who has earned place among us. Sarah held the dress against herself, feeling the weight and warmth of the deerskin, the careful craftsmanship that represented hours of labor by women who barely knew her. It was a gift beyond price, and it carried a message that hit her like a physical blow. You belong here. That night, Sarah lay on her sleeping furs and stared up at the smoke hole in the lodge roof, watching the stars whirl slowly overhead. For the first time since her family's death, she felt the possibility of genuine happiness stirring in her chest. Not the careful contentment she had aimed for in Cedar Ridge, but real joy at being alive and valued and connected to something larger than herself. The transformation was not immediate or easy. There were days when Sarah struggled with homesickness for the familiar routines of her old life, even though that life had been largely miserable. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of Comanche social customs, when she feared she would never truly understand the unwritten rules that governed her new community. But there were also breakthrough moments that made all the struggle worthwhile. The first time she successfully completed a complex beading pattern without supervision. The day she was included in an important discussion about the band's winter plans. The afternoon when a group of children sought her out to help them with a project, treating her as just another adult member of their community rather than a curiosity to be observed from a distance. Winter came early that year, with the first serious snow falling while the leaves were still turning. Sarah had worried about how she would handle the close quarters and intense social dynamics of the winter camp, but instead she found the season to be one of unexpected intimacy and growth. The long winter evenings were filled with storytelling, skill sharing, and the kind of deep conversations that could only happen when people were snowed in together for months at a time. Sarah found herself becoming particularly close to a group of women near her own age, relationships that went beyond the mentor-student dynamic she had with Singing Bird. These friendships were unlike anything she had experienced in Cedar Ridge, where her social interactions had been limited to brief, functional exchanges with Mrs. Patterson and the boarders. Here, she discovered the joy of real companionship with people who appreciated her quick wit, valued her growing skills, and included her in the complex network of relationships that held the community together. As winter deepened, Sarah realized that her relationship with Tahlequah was also evolving in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. The formal courtesy of their early interactions was giving way to something more intimate and comfortable. He sought out her opinions on matters ranging from hunting strategies to intertribal politics, treating her insights as valuable contributions rather than amusing diversions. More importantly, he seemed to genuinely enjoy her company in a way that had nothing to do with her usefulness or her compliance with his expectations. They could sit together for hours without speaking, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt natural and right. But Sarah remained cautious about fully opening her heart to the possibility of love. The wounds from 5 years of rejection and judgment ran deep, and part of her still found it hard to believe that someone could see her as truly worthy of devotion. Tahlequah seemed to understand her hesitation without needing explanation, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, while still making his own feelings clear through his actions. The turning point came on a clear, cold night in the depths of winter when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold. Sarah had never seen the northern lights before, and she stood outside singing Bird's Lodge in wonderment, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she watched the sky dance with color. Tahlequah appeared beside her silently, as he had a way of doing, and They stood together watching the celestial display. After a long time, he spoke, his voice quiet in the hushed winter landscape. "In my people's stories," he said, "the dancing lights are spirits of warriors who died with honor, celebrating in the sky country. They remind us that some things are more beautiful because they are temporary." Sarah understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Everything about their current situation was fragile and temporary. The peace between their peoples, the safety of their winter camp, the luxury of time to build relationships and discover possibilities. The beauty of what they had together was made more precious by the uncertainty of how long they would be allowed to keep it. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted, the words coming out in a visible puff of vapor. "Of what?" "Of believing this is real. Of letting myself be happy only to have it taken away again." Tahlequah turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious in the dancing light from the aurora. "Everything can be taken away," he said simply. "This is why we must be brave enough to love what we have while we have it." The conversation marked a shift in their relationship, a mutual acknowledgement that whatever was growing between them was worth the risk of pain. Over the remaining weeks of winter, Sarah found herself gradually lowering the walls she had built around her heart, allowing herself to believe that she might actually deserve the happiness that seemed to be within reach. When spring finally came to the prairie, bringing with it the time for the band to break their winter camp and resume their seasonal migrations, Sarah faced a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Tahlequah asked her formally to become his wife, to take her place permanently within the community as his partner and equal. The proposal was made in the presence of Singing Bird and several other respected elders, following traditional customs that emphasized the seriousness of the commitment. But it was also deeply personal, acknowledging the unique journey that had brought them together and the unusual circumstances of their courtship. "I claimed Tsukuru as my woman," Tahlequah announced, using the name that had come to represent her true self rather than the identity imposed on her by others. "She has proven her worth through courage and dedication. She has earned her place among us through her own actions." Sarah's acceptance was equally formal and equally heartfelt. "I accept Tahlequah as my husband," she replied, her voice strong and clear. "I choose to bind my life to his and to this people who have shown me what it means to be valued." The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah could have imagined during her years in Cedar Ridge. Instead of the solemn, restrictive ritual she had grown up with, this was a celebration of partnership and community support. The entire band participated in various aspects of the ceremony, offering gifts, sharing stories, and welcoming her formally into their extended family structure. But the most meaningful moment came when Singing Bird presented Sarah with a new name, one that would mark her complete transformation from the broken woman who had fled Cedar Ridge to the strong, capable person she had become. "You came to us as Tsukfu, woman who stands strong," the elder announced. "Now you will be known as Singing Wolf, for you have found your voice and your pack." As Sarah, now Singing Wolf, stood beside her new husband under the vast prairie sky, surrounded by people who had chosen to accept her based on her own merit rather than her tragic history, she finally understood what it meant to be truly free. The woman Cedar Ridge had labeled unlovable had discovered that love was not something that had to be earned through perfection or compliance, but something that grew naturally when people were allowed to be their authentic selves. The transformation was complete. The chains of other people's expectations and judgments had been shattered, replaced by the strong bonds of chosen family and earned respect. Sarah McKenna was gone forever, and in her place stood Singing Wolf, a woman who knew her own worth and would never again allow anyone to define her value for her. 2 years into her marriage with Tahlequah, Singing Wolf had settled into a life that felt as natural as breathing. She had mastered the intricate skills required to thrive in Comanche society, from the complex art of beadwork that told stories through patterns to the practical knowledge needed to help the band move efficiently across vast distances following the buffalo herds. More importantly, she had found her voice within the community, becoming known for her ability to mediate disputes and her keen insight into problems that required creative solutions. But the peace that had allowed her transformation could not last forever. The spring of 1867 brought troubling news from scouts who ranged far ahead of the main band. White settlements were expanding rapidly westward, bringing with them not only farmers and ranchers, but also military units tasked with forcing all native tribes onto designated reservations. The days of free movement across traditional hunting grounds were coming to an end, and every band faced the same impossible choice: submit to confinement on government-controlled land or fight a war they could not hope to win. Singing Wolf watched her husband struggle with the weight of leadership as these reports accumulated. As a war chief, Tahlequah was responsible not just for military decisions, but for the welfare of every person in their band. The elderly who could not endure a long flight from pursuing soldiers, the mothers with small children who needed stability and safety, the young warriors who burned to fight regardless of the odds. All of them looked to him for guidance in navigating an increasingly impossible situation. The debates within the band were intense and often painful. Some argued for accepting reservation life, believing that accommodation with the whites was the only path to survival. Others insisted that death was preferable to the slow destruction of their culture that would come with confinement. Still others proposed splitting the band, allowing those who wished to surrender to do so while the rest continued to resist. Singing Wolf found herself in a unique position during these discussions. Her background gave her insights into white thinking and motivations that few others possessed, but her complete integration into Comanche society meant she was trusted to have the band's best interests at heart. When she spoke in council meetings, people listened with respect rather than suspicion. But her most important role was as Tahlequah's private counselor, the person he could speak with honestly about his fears and doubts without compromising his public position as a strong leader. In the privacy of their lodge, she saw the toll that impossible choices were taking on the man she loved. "There is no good path forward," Tahlequah told her one night as they lay together listening to the wind move through the grass outside their lodge. "Every choice leads to loss. The only question is what kind of loss we can live with." Singing Wolf understood the weight of his words. She had seen what life on reservations meant for Native people. The slow erosion of identity, the dependence on government rations, the constant supervision by agents who viewed their charges as children incapable of managing their own affairs. But she had also seen what happened to bands that chose to fight. The relentless pursuit by military units, the gradual attrition of warriors, the ultimate destruction of everyone who refused to surrender. "What do you think we should do?" she asked, though she knew the question was unfair. The burden of decision should not fall on her shoulders, but sometimes talking through options with someone who shared his perspective helped clarify his own thinking. "I think we should fight," Tahlequah said quietly. "Not because we can win, but because some things are worth dying for. Our children should know that we did not give up our way of life without a struggle." Singing Wolf felt her heart clench with fear and pride in equal measure. She loved this man partly because of his courage, his refusal to compromise his principles even when faced with overwhelming odds. But she also understood what his choice would mean for both of them personally and for everyone in their band. The decision was made final when a delegation of soldiers arrived at their camp under a flag of truce, carrying demand from the territorial governor that all Comanche bands report to designated agencies within 60 days or face military action. The messenger, a young lieutenant who clearly found his duty distasteful, delivered his ultimatum with the mechanical precision of someone reciting memorized instructions. Tahlequah's response was equally formal and infinitely more dignified. "Tell your chief that the Comanche have lived free on this land since before his grandfathers were born. We will not trade our freedom for the promise of safety, even if that safety were real." The lieutenant nodded as if he had expected this answer. As he prepared to leave, his eyes fell on Singing Wolf, and she saw recognition dawn in his expression. She realized with shock of her own that she knew him. He was Thomas Mitchell, the youngest son of a family that had lived on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. He had been barely 16 when she left, but his features had matured into recognizable adult form. "Sarah?" Thomas asked, his voice uncertain. "Sarah McKenna? We heard you were dead." The use of her old name hit Singing Wolf like a physical blow. For 2 years, she had been completely immersed in her new identity, and hearing herself referred to by the name of the broken woman she used to be felt like having cold water thrown in her face. She was acutely aware of everyone in the camp listening to this exchange, trying to understand what it meant. "That woman is dead," Singing Wolf replied calmly. "I'm Singing Wolf now, wife of Tahlequah, member of this band." Thomas stared at her in obvious confusion. Taking in her Comanche dress, her sun-darkened skin, the confidence in her bearing that had been completely absent during her years in Cedar Ridge. Whatever he had expected to find if he encountered the missing white woman, it clearly was not this. "You're here voluntarily?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You chose this." "I chose freedom over a cage," Singing Wolf replied. "I chose to be valued for who I am rather than pitted for what happened to me." The young officer looked around the camp as if seeing it for the first time, noting the obvious prosperity and organization, the healthy children playing between the lodges, the respectful way the adults interacted with each other. His preconceptions about savage Indians holding captive white women were clearly being challenged by what he observed. But duty was duty, regardless of personal doubts. Thomas delivered his message and departed, leaving behind a community that now faced the certainty of war. But his visit had also created a new complication for Singing Wolf personally. Her past had followed her into her new life in a way that could potentially create problems for both her and her husband. The whispered conversations that followed the lieutenant's departure made it clear that some band members were now questioning whether Singing Wolf's loyalties might be divided. Could a woman who had once been white be trusted completely when conflict with white soldiers became inevitable? Would she choose her birth people over her chosen family if forced to make that decision? Singing Wolf was deeply hurt by these doubts, but she also understood them. Trust that had taken years to build could be damaged in moments, and the stakes were too high for anyone to take unnecessary risks. Rather than demand that her loyalty be accepted without proof, she chose to demonstrate it through actions that would leave no room for doubt. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Within 2 weeks of the lieutenant's visit, scouts reported the approach of a large cavalry unit moving in their direction. The soldiers were not flying a flag of truce this time. They were clearly preparing for battle, with scouts ranging far ahead of the main force, and supply wagons suggesting they were equipped for an extended campaign. The band's immediate response was to break camp and move deeper into terrain that would be difficult for cavalry to navigate effectively. But everyone knew that flight would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Eventually, they would have to either fight or surrender, and Tahlequah had already made clear which option he preferred. The battle, when it came, was nothing like the romanticized conflicts described in the dime novels that had been popular in Cedar Ridge. It was dirty, desperate, and chaotic, with both sides fighting for survival rather than glory. Singing Wolf found herself in the thick of the action, not as a helpless victim to be protected, but as an active participant in her people's defense. She had learned to use weapons during her time with the band, partly out of practical necessity, and partly because Tahlequah believed everyone should be capable of protecting themselves. But she had never expected to use those skills against soldiers who might include people she had once known. The first time she fired her rifle at charging cavalry, she was surprised by her own lack of hesitation. These men were threatening her family, her home, her chosen life. Their skin color and cultural background were irrelevant in the face of that threat. The battle lasted most of a day, with neither side achieving decisive victory. The soldiers were better equipped and had superior numbers, but the Comanche knew the terrain and used it to their advantage, striking quickly and then fading away before concentrated force could be brought against them. By evening, both sides were exhausted, having inflicted casualties without gaining clear advantage. But the real test for Singing Wolf came during the temporary lull when wounded from both sides were being tended. She was helping treat injured warriors when she heard English voices calling for help from a ravine where several soldiers had taken cover. The voices were young and frightened, speaking of wounds that needed immediate attention and companions who might bleed to death without assistance. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Singing Wolf stood paralyzed by conflicting impulses. Her medical knowledge, learned from Singing Bird and other healers, made her acutely aware of what untreated wounds could mean. Her basic humanity rebelled against the idea of allowing suffering when she had the power to alleviate it. But she also knew that helping enemy soldiers could be seen as betrayal by her own people, confirmation of the doubts that some still harbored about her true loyalty. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Singing Wolf gathered medical supplies and approached the ravine where the wounded soldiers waited, calling out in English to let them know she was coming to help. The surprised gratitude of the young men when she appeared touched something deep in her heart, even as she remained fully committed to her people's cause. Working quickly and efficiently, she treated wounds, set broken bones, and provided water to men who had been trying to kill her friends and family just hours earlier. She spoke to them gently in their own language, offering the kind of comfort that came naturally to her despite the circumstances. But she also made her position clear when one of the soldiers, a boy who could not have been more than 18, asked her tearfully if she would help them escape. "I cannot do that," Singing Wolf said firmly. "You are enemies of my people, and I will not betray them. But I will not let you suffer needlessly either." The distinction was important to her, even if the wounded soldiers could not fully understand it. She was not helping them because she identified with their cause or felt conflicted about her loyalty. She was helping them because healing was part of who she was, regardless of politics or tribal affiliations. When she returned to the Comanche camp, Singing Wolf found that her actions had been observed by several warriors, including some who had been among those questioning her loyalty. Their response surprised her. Instead of anger or suspicion, she saw something that looked like respect. Tahlequah pulled her aside to speak privately, his expression serious but not angry. "You could have let them die," he said. "No one would have blamed you. They came here to destroy us." "I know," Singing Wolf replied, "but that would not have been who I am. And if I had betrayed my own nature to prove my loyalty to the band, what would that loyalty be worth?" Her husband studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "This is why I chose you," he said simply. "Not because you rejected your old life completely, but because you brought the best parts of yourself into your new one." The conversation marked the end of any serious questions about Singing Wolf's commitment to her chosen people. She had demonstrated that her loyalty did not require her to abandon her compassion, and that her complex background was a source of strength rather than weakness for the band. But the larger conflict was far from over. The cavalry unit had withdrawn to regroup and receive reinforcements, but they would be back with greater numbers and better preparation. The brief respite gave the band time to tend their wounded and plan their next move, but everyone understood that the situation was ultimately hopeless. It was during this tense period that Singing Wolf made a proposal that surprised even her husband. She suggested that she could use her knowledge of white culture and her personal history to negotiate on the band's behalf, potentially securing better terms than would be offered to groups that simply fought until they were overwhelmed. "You could be our voice with their leaders," Tahlequah said thoughtfully. "Someone who understands both worlds and can speak for us as equals rather than as supplicants." The idea was risky on multiple levels. Singing Wolf would have to venture into white-controlled territory, possibly including a return to places she had deliberately left behind. She would have to convince military commanders and government officials to see the Comanche as human beings worthy of respect rather than obstacles to be eliminated. And she would have to do all of this while maintaining her own identity and principles, refusing to become the token reformed savage that whites might expect her to be. But it was also an opportunity to use her unique background for something meaningful, to bridge two worlds in service of the people she had chosen as her own. As she prepared for what might be the most important mission of her life, Singing Wolf reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had been labeled unlovable and damaged beyond repair was now preparing to risk everything to save the people who had taught her what love actually meant. The broken victim had become a warrior diplomat, ready to face any challenge in defense of the family she had chosen and the life she had built through her own courage and determination. The test that lay ahead would determine not just the fate of her band, but the final proof of her complete transformation from Sarah McKenna into Singing Wolf. She had shattered the chains of other people's expectations and forged new bonds based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Now it was time to discover whether those new bonds were strong enough to withstand the ultimate challenge. The journey to Fort Richardson took Singing Wolf through country she had not seen in over 2 years, landscapes that held memories of her former life like ghosts haunting the horizon. She rode alone, despite Tahlequah's concerns about her safety, because the mission required her to appear as a woman, making her own choices rather than as a representative controlled by her husband or band. The symbolism mattered as much as the substance of what she hoped to accomplish. Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer at Fort Richardson, was a career soldier who had spent decades fighting various Indian tribes across the Western Territories. He was known for his tactical competence, but also for his rigid adherence to military protocol and his deep skepticism about the possibility of peaceful coexistence between whites and Indians. When Singing Wolf requested a meeting with him, his initial response was dismissive. "I don't negotiate with squaws," he told his aide loudly enough for Singing Wolf to hear from the outer office where she waited. "If the Comanche want to surrender, they can send their chiefs like civilized people." But curiosity eventually overcame prejudice, particularly when Harrison learned that the woman requesting the meeting was rumored to be a former captive who had chosen to remain with her captors. He agreed to see her, though he made it clear through his manner and the armed guards he stationed around the room that he considered the meeting to be a waste of time at best and a potential security risk at worst. Singing Wolf entered the colonel's office wearing her finest Comanche dress, her hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She moved with the confident bearing of a woman who knew her own worth, her posture radiating the kind of quiet dignity that commanded respect regardless of cultural background. "You wanted to see me," Harrison said without preamble, remaining seated behind his desk in a deliberate display of disrespect. "Make it quick. I have real business to attend to." Singing Wolf studied him for a moment, taking in the gray hair, the weathered face marked by years of outdoor service, the cold eyes that had seen too much violence to believe in the possibility of peace. This was a man who had reduced complex human conflicts to simple equations of superior and inferior force, and who would not be easily convinced that other solutions existed. "My name is Singing Wolf," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I am here to speak for my people, the band led by Tahlequah, about terms for ending the current conflict." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness and the quality of her English. Whatever he had expected from this meeting, it was clearly not a woman who spoke with the authority of an equal rather than the deference of a supplicant. "Your people," he repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. Interesting choice of words from someone who was born white. "Tell me, miss." He paused, clearly fishing for her original name. "My name is Singing Wolf," she repeated firmly. "What I was called in my previous life is not relevant to this discussion."